trials of Paul before the judge. If you turn with me to Mark chapter 6, there is an event in the life of John the Baptist and his experience when he was detained in Macros, situated overlooking the Dead Sea, that would have some particular relevance for the Apostle Paul as he was detained before Governor Felix. Now, why was John the Baptist in Mark chapter 6 there in Macros? Who had bound him? In verse 17 of Mark chapter 6, it says, "For Herod himself," this is Herod Antipas, "had sent forth and laid hold upon John, and bound him in prison for Herodias' sake, his brother Philip's wife, for Herod Antipas had married Herodias." And so in verse 17 of Mark chapter 6, you see that John the Baptist had been bound by a ruler who had a Jewish wife. Verse 18, "For John had said unto Herod, It's not lawful for thee to have thy brother's wife." And in verse 18, John the Baptist had been arrested pertaining to principles that were found in the Jewish law. And furthermore, in verse 20 of Mark chapter 6, we find this little detail that though John had been bound by a ruler who had a Jewish wife, and he had been arrested over principles that were found in the Jewish law, verse 20 says, "For Herod feared John, knowing that he was a just man and a holy, and he observed him. And when he heard him, he did many things and heard him gladly." So, though Herod Antipas here in Mark chapter 6 was a man of many faults and many vices, this ruler was willing to hear a man of God and heard him often and even heard him gladly. But John the Baptist was bound for the better part of 2 whole years there in Macros, overlooking the sea. And he was bound until a convenient day arrived. And in verse 21 of Mark chapter 6, it says, "When a convenient day was come, that Herod gathered together such and such." And this would be the day when John the Baptist would die. And that convenient day in verse 21, it means an opportune time. And it was an opportune time here for Herod Antipas when he silenced the voice of God in Mark chapter 6, John the Baptist. So when we look forward into the life of Paul, and he is bound by Felix, who has a Jewish wife pertaining to principles found in the Jewish law, bound for the better part of 2 years, why couldn't it be that the Apostle Paul, the light to the Gentiles, would be extinguished, just like the voice of God was put to silence? Because if you come with me to Acts chapter 25, you can't help but notice that what had been upon the mind of the Apostle Paul as he was going through the very same experiences of John the Baptist, waiting for a convenient time to come. But here's the difference between the Apostle Paul and John the Baptist. For when the news came to the Apostle Paul's holding chamber, it wasn't his day that was coming. It was Felix's. Because when we come forward to Acts chapter 25, we find verse 27, of Acts 24, "But after 2 years, Porcius Festus came into Felix's room." And so when we come into the life of the Apostle Paul, he would not have his light extinguished. It would be that of Felix who would. And Porcius Festus was going to come into his very same position. And this man, Porcius Festus, which we're going to consider as the judge here in our 5th class, the trials of Paul, is going to have a heavy impact on the life of the Apostle Paul. Because Porcius Festus is going to change a man's destiny. That's the Apostle Paul. He's going to guard a man's deliverance, and he's going to hear a man's defense. And this Festus, who is going to take the place of Governor Felix, is going to preside as a judge. And he is going to impact the life of the Apostle Paul in numerous ways. Now, this man, Porcius Festus, was a man who was in the line of governors, and he was Judea's ruler. And on the Bible marking sheet, these are the governors who took the seat as Judea's ruler leading up to the time of the Apostle Paul. So, for example, in AD 36 to 37, there was Governor Marcellus. AD 37 to 41, there was Governor Marullus. In AD 41 to 44, there was Governor Agrippa I, not to be confused with the king. In AD 44 to 46, there was Governor Festus. In AD 46 to 48, there was Governor Alexander. In AD 48 to 52, there was Governor Cumanus. In AD 52 to 60, there was Governor Felix, which we have considered in the book of Acts. And now we come all the way up to AD 60, because from AD 60 to 62, there was now Governor Festus. And it's maybe worth noting that in chapter 25 of Acts 25, that this is when this chapter is going to take place, in AD 60. Because the events of chapter 25 of Acts are going to be at the beginning of Festus's governorship. But what is going to set apart Festus from Felix is that Festus will actually perform the role of a judge, which Felix could not. Because Felix simply left Paul bound. He didn't make a judgment. And so he did not fulfill that portion of Judea's ruler. But what we're going to find here at Acts 25 is that Festus will. And so when Festus came into the office of Judea's governor, what was his top priority? Now in verse 1 of Acts 25, it says, "Now when Festus was come into the province, after 3 days he ascended from Caesarea to Jerusalem." So when a prime minister takes up the office, or a president takes up their office, there's a priority list. And in 3 days, Festus had it known that he needed to ascend to Jerusalem. It shows you where the priority of the governor felt that he needed to get up to Jerusalem. Now, who was this man? He was different from Governor Felix in numerous ways. And this is from Paul the Apostle by W.H. Bolton on page 183. And this is what he has to say about Porcius Festus. He says, "Although little is known about Porcius Festus, it is clear he was a marked contrast to Felix. Josephus has only passing allusions to him, and he occupied the position of procurator or governor of Judea for less than 2 years before he died. He took his office seriously, and 3 days after his arrival in the province, he went to Jerusalem. It was natural he should go there, for it was the chief city of the Jews. The object of his visit was to meet the leaders of the Jews." Now, if going to Jerusalem was Festus's top priority, then what was the top priority for the leaders of the Jews when he arrived? Well, verse 2. "Then the high priest and the chief of the Jews informed Festus against Paul and besought him and desired favor against him that he would send for Paul to Jerusalem, laying wait in the way to kill him." Now, brothers and sisters, this is 2 years on. Paul has been sitting in the chamber, bound in Caesarea Maritima for 2 years. Now, just to give us an appreciation of how long 2 years, it was 2 years ago that the war in Ukraine began. It began in 2022 of February. So 2 years ago, that's a long time. But you notice in verse 2 and 3, This is the top priority for these Jews that are there in Jerusalem. And it's so much of a top priority that you see at the end of verse 3 that they wanted Paul to come to Jerusalem so they could lay wait in the way to kill him. Now, Young's literal translates that little phrase at the end of verse 3 of Acts 25, to make an ambush to put him to death in the way. They had no desire for Paul to get to Jerusalem. They simply wanted him to be put on the journey. So that Young's literal says they could make an ambush to put him to death in the way. And this was the top priority for the Jews at Jerusalem. And if Festus were to acquiesce to their request and send Paul to Jerusalem, it meant to sign his death warrant. But Festus, he was a man of some principle because he was going to keep Paul at Caesarea Maritima. Because notice how Festus responds in verse 4 of Acts 25. But Festus answered that Paul should be kept at Caesarea, and that he himself would depart shortly thither. So let them, therefore, said he, which among you are able, go down with me to accuse this man, if there be any wickedness in him. And you see, Festus would not be persuaded. Now, it's a really fascinating book in our community, and is by John M. Hallowell, and it's entitled Beginning at Jerusalem. If you want to endeavor to do a study on the book of Acts, it's quite helpful. And it sort of walks through the various high points of the book of Acts. And this is what he says on page 309 about this Caesarean trial. He says, Festus was not to be persuaded. No doubt he had been informed that Paul was a Roman citizen. And accordingly, he insisted that, since Paul was already in custody at his headquarters, and he was about to return there soon, the trial would be conducted there. It is also probable that Festus wished to assert his authority and insist that Roman practice be followed, especially since the earlier trial had been held in Caesarea. It is also possible that Festus had been briefed by his own staff that an attempt had been made on Paul's life already. And you see, it's likely that the Jews had showed their cards. They were terrible poker players, and Festus had read them. And it is certain that the man Festus replaced, Felix, had failed to act as a judge. Would Festus uphold that office of his governorship and sit in the judgment seat and act as a judge for the Apostle Paul? Because here's what it says in verse 6. And when Festus had tarried among them more than 10 days, he went down unto Caesarea, and the next day, sitting in the judgment seat, commanded Paul to be brought. And when he was come, the Jews which came down from Jerusalem stood round about and laid many and grievous complaints against Paul, which they could not prove. Now, when it says in verse 6 that he had tarried among them more than 10 days, you might have a marginal note that next to that phrase in verse 6, it says no more than 8 or 10 days. And so Festus did not delay to actually get down from Jerusalem to Caesarea Maritima, because the marginal note in verse 6 says that it wasn't more than 10 days, it was no more than 8 or 10 days. And what was he going to sit on? In verse 6, the judgment seat. Now, if you have a pencil, you might like to underline this, but this is a key phrase in Acts 25. Because in verse 6, it says that Festus was going to sit in the judgment seat. Verse 9. Later he would ask the Apostle Paul if he would go to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before him. In verse 10, then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. Verse 15, later Festus will say that the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. Verse 17, on the morrow I sat on the judgment seat. And finally, in verse 20 of Acts 25, at the very end, and there be judged of these matters. You see, this is a key phrase in Acts 25. The judgment seat. Judged. This is what the Apostle Paul would have been looking for from Festus, to stand up and act as the judge and adjudicate on this trial, because no one had done so previous to this occasion for the Apostle Paul. But it must have perplexed Festus greatly why Paul, who had the utmost respect and reverence for the law and the temple, should be so hated by his fellow Jews. Because you notice in verse 7 that when these Jews came down from Jerusalem and they stood round about the Apostle Paul, they laid, verse 7, many grievous complaints against Paul. Now, the word grievous in verse 7, it means weighty. And the word complaints, it means charges. And so these Jews who came down from Jerusalem, they were giving weighty charges. You can just imagine that they tried to layer upon these charges against the Apostle Paul. It's almost like we have a reoccurrence of Acts 24. These weighty charges that they were bringing against the Apostle Paul. But there was one problem for them. They couldn't prove the charges. And worse, Paul was able to refute them. And this would have perplexed Festus. Absolutely it would have. And you notice what kind of weighty charges that these Jews were laying against the Apostle Paul. Because in verse 8, this is how Paul responds. So this tells us what the weighty charges were. Verse 8, and while Paul answered for himself, neither against the law of the Jews, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar have I offended anything at all. And you can't help but notice that we have neither against the law, neither against the temple, nor yet against Caesar. And we looked at this last week, brothers and sisters, that these were the two pinnacles of what the Jews were trying to lay against Paul. Jewish charges and Roman charges. Because the law and the temple pertained to the Jewish charges they were laying against Paul, and Caesar, the Roman charges. They were trying to make it complete so that the greatest amount of arousal in the mind of Festus would be ignited. And so they had these Jewish charges, the law and the temple, and these Roman charges against Caesar. And when they laid these weighty charges against Paul, I imagine that he would have thought of another instance in his own life in the book of Acts, when he was brought not before a judge in Judea, but a judge in Achaia. Now you come back with me to Acts chapter 18. This event took place not in Judea, in Caesarea Maritima, but in Acts 18, this event took place in Achaia, in the city of Corinth. And Paul was not before a judge of Judea, but he was before a judge of Achaia. And notice the similarities here back in Acts chapter 18. You can't help but feel that the Apostle Paul would have been pulled back here to these events that had happened in his life before. Now here was the story. The Apostle Paul, verse 11 of Acts 18, he had been there for a year and 6 months, and he had preached the word of God there in Corinth. So a long time. But notice what happened in verse 12 of Acts chapter 18. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia. Now it's important to note that when you look in history, that in verse 12, this was the very beginning of Gallio's deputyism of Achaia. So what you find is when you look through the books, that this is actually the beginning of Gallio's rulership in Achaia. And what do you notice? The Jews take the opportunity. So verse 12, when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, and this is AD 50, the Jews made an insurrection with one accord against Paul, and they brought him, notice, to the judgment seat. And what did they say when they brought Paul to the judgment seat of Gallio, who had just taken it? Verse 13. This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law. Different city, different province, same charges, just blended together. Because in verse 13, when they said, this fellow persuadeth men to worship God, those are Jewish charges. And when they said, contrary to the law, those are Roman charges. Now, why do I say that? Another interesting comment from this book, Beginning at Jerusalem by John Halliwell, page 242. It makes an interesting note, which is worth thinking. He says, speaking of here in Acts 18, their charge was that Paul was persuading the people to worship God in ways contrary to the law. It is not clear whether they specifically meant their own Mosaic law or more probably Roman law, since that would be more relevant to Gallio. Their complaint would then be that Paul was introducing an illicit religion, not approved by the Roman authorities as Judaism was. It may be that the charge was made deliberately ambiguous in order to elicit the support of the Roman authorities. And so in verse 13, when they say that this fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law, I believe, and this is probably a good idea, is that they were trying to make it deliberately ambiguous. Which law are you referring to? Well, in order to heighten Gallio's response, he would have to believe that, are you referring to Roman law or Jewish law? But here's the important difference between this event in Acts 18 and Acts 25. Gallio did not support the Jews. Because notice verse 14 of Acts 18. Before the Apostle Paul could step forward and answer for himself, verse 14, and when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, if it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it. For I will be no judge of such matters. And Gallio drave them from the judgment seat. And you see, Gallio called them out. He said, if you're making this ambiguous, Roman law or Jewish law, then there's a difference. But if this is happening just because of your own law, then I will be no judge of you. And verse 16 says, he drave them from the judgment seat. And here's the critical point. Gallio the judge had dismissed a mob of Jews and declared Paul innocent. And notice what it says in verse 18 of Acts 18, that after this event, and Paul after this tarried there yet a good while, and he was free to go. Because Gallio took no pleasure in the Jews before his judgment seat, and he vindicated the Apostle Paul in Corinth. Gallio took no pleasure in the Jews. But if you come back to Acts chapter 25, very sadly for the Apostle Paul, Festus was no Gallio. Because whereas Gallio took no pleasure in the Jews, Festus did. And all hope that Paul had that Festus would be the judge that he so desperately needed and wanted, it was to little avail. Because you notice back in Acts chapter 25 and verse 9, but Festus, willing to do the Jews a pleasure. Now that word pleasure in verse 9 of Acts 25, it's the same word in verse 3 of Acts 25. That when in verse 3 that the Jews of Jerusalem, they desired favor against the Apostle Paul. And so what we're being told in Acts 25 and verse 9 is that here was Festus who was willing to do the Jews a favor. This is so unfortunate, brothers and sisters, because here now is a man who is more apt to walk a middle line when he ought not to. You can kind of think in our own lives that we're being asked to one side or this side, or maybe a middle line. But at that moment, it's actually not appropriate to walk a middle line. It's not. And we have to think in our own lives, where will those occasions arise? Where there's this side and there's that side. We think, I think I'll take a middle line on this. And we have to be sober-minded in our decision-making that is that actually appropriate to walk a middle line? Because you notice here's what Festus was trying to do. He was trying to walk a middle line between giving a favor to the Jews, but yet somehow still upholding the rights and privileges of a Roman citizen. Because there was nothing stopping Festus from declaring then and there as the judge, this man is nothing worthy of the bonds and he's free to go. And you Jews, you're free to go back to Jerusalem. There was nothing stopping him from doing that. But he walked a middle line. And just think about how this was going to prolong the imprisonment of the Apostle Paul. And perhaps we might take stock of our own decision-making and think where in our own lives are we being asked to make a decision, and the middle line is not one we should make. Because here was Festus, verse 9, willing to do the Jews a pleasure, a favor. And here is what he did to the Apostle Paul, verse 9. Paul, wilt thou go up to Jerusalem and there be judged of these things before me? And this was a pivotal moment in the life of the Apostle Paul. Because brothers and sisters, if he said, yes, I'll go to Jerusalem, he never would have got there. He would have been ambushed in the way and he would have been slain. And this was a pivotal moment in terms of the response of the Apostle Paul, because it meant life and death. You think about these examples in the scriptures, brothers and sisters, moments of change in the life of the faithful, pivotal moments. Because the Apostle Paul, he has been asked where he will be judged. And no doubt in Jerusalem, he'd be slain on the way. Acts 25, verse 9. How about this one? Hananiah, Mishael, and Azariah in Daniel 3, verse 18. Before the king Nebuchadnezzar, he said, are these things true? You won't bow down to my golden image and worship it? And they had to give an answer. How about Ahimelech when he's brought before a murderous King Saul in 1 Samuel 22 in verse 13? Saul said, why have you conspired against me? How about Stephen in Acts chapter 7 and verse 1? When he was brought before the Jewish council, they said, are these things so? And he gave his discourse. And how about one of the greatest examples of all? In Matthew 26, verse 63, the Lord Jesus Christ, adjured by the living God to not answer that question, brought death in and of itself. And we think, brothers and sisters, the pivotal moments in our own life, they really do not have, thankfully, I suppose, a matter of life and death. But there are pivotal moments in our own lives when we have to speak up and we have to declare the faith, even knowing that it has grievous consequences to come. And you just think about the Apostle Paul here for a second. He was unlikely to see Jerusalem for a very long time, maybe never again, in this moment. And he was unlikely to see Rome as a free man. And you see, Paul had hoped that Festus would have been the judge he needed, but Festus was simply the judge the Lord had provided. And so this is what the Apostle Paul provided that judge, and here was his answer, verse 10 of Acts 25. Then said Paul, I stand at Caesar's judgment seat, where I ought to be judged. To the Jews have I done no wrong, as thou very well knowest. For if I be an offender, or have committed anything worthy of death, I refuse not to die. But if there be none of these things whereof they accuse me, no man may deliver me unto them. I appeal unto Caesar. And you can't help but notice, maybe just a crescendo of how Paul answered Festus there. No man may deliver me. including you, Festus. You're walking a middle line, and you ought not to, and no man will deliver me into the hands of the Jews. I appeal unto a greater man, even greater than you, Caesar. Oh, brothers and sisters, that would have ruffled Festus's feathers. Absolutely it would have. Because what the Apostle Paul had done is he had called upon one of his Roman rights there in that trial to avoid certain death known as Caesarem appello. As if in a flash, Paul realized that the proposed move presented him with a way out that would also fulfill his Lord's prophecy, namely that just as he had testified in Jerusalem, so also he must testify to his Lord in Rome. Caesarem appello, I appeal unto Caesar. This unexpected turn must have taken Festus aback, for it is unlikely he had expected anything like Paul's response. And notice the terse response from Festus in verse 12. Then Festus, when he had conferred with the council, answered, Hast thou appealed unto Caesar? Unto Caesar thou shalt go. You don't want my judgment seat? Then you will go to another judgment seat. You can just imagine the testiness which would have happened here in this courtroom between the Apostle Paul, no man may deliver me, well then you will get a man, and he might not be as merciful as I have been. You just see how this might have been a testy courtroom. And just like that, Paul the Roman was destined for Caesar in Rome. And that is what leads us to the introduction of one man, Agrippa the king. Because in verse 13, it says, And after certain days, King Agrippa and Bernice, they came unto Caesarea to salute Festus. Now, brothers and sisters, after certain days, King Agrippa, who was over the governors of that time, he was going to come with his sister Bernice, and almost as it were, welcome Festus to his governorship. Now, King Agrippa there in verse 13, his full name is Marcus Julius Agrippa. Now, Marcus means a defense, and Agrippa means hero-like. And so this man, Agrippa, he was going to have a hero-like defense about him. In other words, he was guarded. He was protected. He had a hero-like defense to him. That's what his name meant, Marcus Agrippa. And he was known as Marcus Julius Agrippa, and he was the second. Now, he, King Agrippa II, was the son of King Agrippa I. And here's what Unger's Bible Dictionary says on page 477, that when King Herod Agrippa I died in AD 44, he left his son and 3 daughters named Bernice, Miriam, and Drusilla. Agrippa II was born in AD 27 and was but a stripling of 17 years of age at his father's death. He was resident at the imperial capital, Rome, receiving his education under the patronage of the emperor. And when his uncle Herod, king of Chalcis, died in AD 48, he, Agrippa II, attained the 21st year of his age, and Claudius appointed him to be ruler of that vacant kingdom. And so, from the age of 21, King Agrippa became a king, and he was a ruler over a kingdom. And this gives us an appreciation of who this man is when we look at his family tree. Now, this is Herod the Great's family tree. And when you look at Herod the Great, who had a son Aristobulus, who then had a son Herod Agrippa I, who then had his son Herod Agrippa II. And so what that tells us is that Agrippa here in Acts 25 and verse 13, he was the great-grandson of Herod the Great. He had 3 sisters. He had Miriam, Drusilla, who was married to Felix, and Bernice, mentioned in verse 13. He was a Roman citizen by birth. He was of no mean city, sitting at the feet of renowned teachers in Rome. And when you look through the history books, he excelled above many of his equals, being exceeding zealous for glory. And I think, brothers and sisters, one of the notable features about Agrippa here in Acts 25, verse 13, is his age. Because if he was born in AD 27, and this chapter is taking place in AD 60, then Agrippa was 33 years of age when he met the Apostle Paul. He was a young man who had his whole life ahead of him, a life of glory and prestige and opportunity as a king. And when he came to Caesarea Maritima and he welcomed Festus, Festus informed Agrippa of one case. Because in verse 14 to verse 21, Festus is going to inform Agrippa about the case of the Apostle Paul. And notice the features that Festus is going to give to Agrippa about this case. Here's what he said in verse 14. And when they had been there many days, Festus declared Paul's case unto the king, saying, There's a certain man left in bonds by Felix, about whom, when I was at Jerusalem, the chief priests and the elders of the Jews informed me, desiring to have judgment against him. To whom I answered, It is not the manner of the Romans to deliver any man to die, before that he which is accused have the accusers face to face, and having license to answer for himself concerning the crime laid against him. Therefore, when they were come hither, without any delay, on the morrow I sat on the judgment seat and commanded the man to be brought forth. Against whom, when his accusers stood up, they brought none accusation of such things as I supposed, but had certain questions against him of their own superstition, and of one Jesus, which was dead, whom Paul affirmed to be alive. And because I doubted of such manner of questions, I asked him whether he would go to Jerusalem, and there be judged of these matters. But when Paul had appealed to be reserved unto the hearing of Augustus, I commanded him to be kept, till I might send him to Caesar. Then Agrippa said unto Festus, I would also hear the man myself. Now, brothers and sisters, you can't help but read this in a certain way. Festus has declared from verse 14 to verse 21 the case of the Apostle Paul, and almost 95% of his instruction to Agrippa is procedural, Roman procedural. And then when he finishes declaring the case to Agrippa, verse 22 says that Agrippa, unsolicited, makes the appeal that I would also hear this man myself. Now, why would Agrippa do that? It's almost as if when Agrippa heard that Paul was going to be getting onto a ship and he was going to be going to Rome, that Agrippa did not want to have this opportunity miss him. He wanted to first hear the Apostle Paul. Now, here's a few suggestions as to why Agrippa might have made his unsolicited appeal to hear the Apostle Paul. Here's one. It is highly probable that Agrippa knew about the uproar at the Feast of Pentecost at the expense of the Apostle Paul 2 years prior. Highly probable. 2, it is highly probable that Agrippa had correspondence with Felix, his brother-in-law, about a notable prisoner bound in Caesarea Maritima. And it is highly probable that Agrippa knew and was well acquainted with the sect everywhere spoken against, and he wanted to hear about it from the Apostle Paul. And besides all this, brothers and sisters, the Herods had a curious history of hearing godly men. Herod the Great heard the Magi in Matthew 2 and verse 3. Herod Antipas heard both John the Baptist in Mark 6 and heard of Jesus in Luke 13, verse 32. Herod Agrippa, his father, heard Peter, James, and John in Acts 12 as he went to persecute them after. And here now, in verse 22 of Acts 25, Herod Agrippa would hear the Apostle Paul. But if you look at verse 19 of what Festus said, this is the only detail that Festus had divulged, which is new to us, the reader, and therefore new to Agrippa. And it's that Paul was stating that the man Jesus had been dead and was resurrected. This is the only detail of what Festus has said, that this is what Paul was claiming. That there was one Jesus who was dead and had been resurrected. And this aroused in the mind of King Agrippa that he had to do everything in his ability to hear the Apostle Paul before he got onto that ship to Rome. And so what did Festus say to him? Verse 22, tomorrow, said Festus, thou shalt hear him. And so Festus would do whatever governor or judge would do in that instance when you had a king in your presence. Verse 23, he would bring them in a pompous show. Because verse 23 of Acts 25 says, and on the morrow, when Agrippa was come, and Bernice, with great pomp, and were entered into the place of hearing with the chief captains and principal men of the city. And you just have to sort of imagine, brothers and sisters, if you will, that this would have been like, instruments blasting, red carpet rolled out, thrones presented, regal apparel. And it says in verse 23 that it was with great pomp. Now that phrase, great pomp, is the only time it's mentioned in all the New Testament. Great pomp. There must have been nothing like it. And what it means, that phrase in verse 23, a great pomp, it means a show. So the doors open, and in comes Agrippa with Bernice at his side. Then the chief captains, then the principal men of the city. And this is the great show that they come and they take their position. But do you notice what it says at the end of verse 23? That after the show was over, then Festus, by his commandment, Paul was brought forth. And you can't help but notice that there's these two juxtaposed entrances. There's the great show with kings and queens, chief captains, principal men, Governor Festus, and then there's the humble, the Apostle Paul, brought forward. The audience brought forward in pomp, and the speaker brought forward in humility. And so Festus stood up, and he presided, and he said in verse 24 of Acts 25, King Agrippa, and all men which are here present with us, you see this man, about whom all the multitude of the Jews have dealt with me, both at Jerusalem and also here, crying that he ought not to live any longer. But when I found that he had committed nothing worthy of death, and that he himself had appealed unto Augustus, I determined to send him, of whom I have no certain thing to write unto my Lord. Wherefore I have brought him forth before you, and specially before thee, O King Agrippa, that after examination I might have somewhat to write. For it seemeth to me unreasonable to send a prisoner, and not withal to signify the crimes laid against him. And in verse 26, Festus had given Agrippa the opportunity to have examination, or as that word in verse 26 means, an investigation. And you can't help but notice, brothers and sisters, that Festus was not speaking to the crowd to investigate the Apostle Paul. He was speaking to one man. Because in verse 24, Festus said, King Agrippa. And in verse 26, I've brought this man specially before thee, O King Agrippa, for you to investigate. And just like that, in verse 1 of Acts 26, Agrippa commandeers the presidership of this great show. Because in verse 1 of Acts 26, then Agrippa said unto Paul, Thou art permitted to speak for thyself. And in Acts 26, the Apostle Paul will not defend his charges. He will defend his faith. He will not speak to this grand audience. He will speak to one individual. And imagine, brothers and sisters, what he will say. Why will he say it? And what will be the outcome of what he says? And this we will conclude our series, The Trials of Paul, Before the King.